Columbus, Ohio. And this is another in the series of presentations by Jewish Voice for Peace, Central Ohio. And in a moment, one of our members, Connie Hammond, will introduce the speaker for this evening. Let me just say that this presentation is being recorded, and later on, if you have questions, you may put them in the chat, and another member of the local chapter, Amy Schuster, will be moderating the questions for our panelist, our guest speaker this evening. Let me just say that a month from now, or a little over a month, we will have another presentation in the February presentation of Jewish Voice for Peace, Central Ohio. And that will be the Reverend Michael Yoshi, the co-chair of the Friends of Wadi Fokin, will discuss how this organization operates to provide financial assistance to support the economic survival of this Palestinian village and the organization's advocacy work in the United States Congress to stop the threat to the village from settlement expansion. So that will be next month. That's Tuesday, February 22nd at 7 p.m. And we will have a Zoom link coming up for that. So now I will turn this over to Connie Hammond, who will be introducing our speaker for tonight. Connie?
Thank you, Farrell. Our distinguished speaker tonight is Khaled Elgindy. He is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, where he is their program on Palestine and Israeli-Palestinian affairs. He's the author of the book Blind Spot, America and the Palestinians from Balfour to Trump, that was published by Brookings Institution Press in April 2019. He previously served as a fellow in the foreign policy program at the Brookings Institution from 2010 to 2018. He served as an advisor to the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah on permanent status negotiations with Israel from 2004 to 2009. And he was a key participant in the Annapolis negotiations of 2007-2008. He's also an adjunct instructor in Arab studies in Georgetown University. His writings have appeared in a wide variety of publications. He's a regular commentator on TV and radio and is frequently quoted in the mainstream press. So we're very honored to have him with us this evening. And I will turn the program over to him with great appreciation.
Great. Thank you, Connie. It's good to see you again. And thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be with you. So I'm gonna talk for a little bit about where I see the state of Palestinian politics, and then we'll just open it up to have a conversation. I'm hopefully not going to talk for too long, but just to sort of help set the scene a little bit. Excuse me. So it's by now, I think, a little bit cliche to point out the fact that Palestinian politics is at a crossroads. In fact, the Palestinian National Movement is at one of, if not the lowest moments in its modern history. I think we're all familiar with the political division that exists between Hamas and Fatah. This is probably one of the more notable pathologies in Palestinian politics, as well as corruption, growing repression. All of these, I think, are symptomatic of other deeper issues related to institutional decay and stagnation, the lack of representativeness, and declining legitimacy of the Palestinian leadership overall. You may remember the decision by President Abbas last spring to cancel planned elections at the last moment. Those elections were actually at a pretty advanced stage in terms of candidate registration, voter registration. All the lists were registered and ready to start campaigning. And at the very last moment, Abbas pulled the rug out from underneath and canceled those all of those elections, which were supposed to happen in a series. Some of you may also remember over the summer the very tragic murder of Nizar Banat, who is a very well-known dissident and critic of the Palestinian president by Palestinian security forces. And to this day, there have been a few, court martials. I suppose you could call them, military trials of a handful of individuals, but no real accountability and no transparency in the process of accountability. So that's part of a pattern, really, of the Palestinian leadership cracking down on really all forms of dissent, both inside government and out. There are lots of stories of Palestinians being arrested for Facebook posts, for any sort of slight of the president or the leadership in general. And some of you may be familiar with the polling situation. For the past few years, at least since 2015, there have been consistent polls that show the vast majority of Palestinians in the occupied territories want Mahmoud Abbas to resign, anywhere between 2/3, and I think it reached last summer well over 3/4. I think around 78% was the highest that I've seen that figure go. That's a real it's a consistent indicator of how deeply unpopular this leadership is among ordinary Palestinians. So in a lot of ways, Palestinian politics, I think, suffers from many of the same pathologies that gave rise to what we used to call the Arab Spring a decade ago. If you remember, in Tunisia and Egypt and other Arab states, this almost domino effect of uprisings and overthrow of various regimes, all of which, sadly, including Tunisia's, which was the most promising, have kind of reverted back to authoritarian systems. Interestingly, the one holdout maybe is in Sudan, where it is there is an attempt to revert back to a military dictatorship that is meeting with a great deal of popular opposition. And of course, the situation in Tunisia is not, that story is still being written in real time. But for the most part, the Arab uprisings have failed. But the key issues that drove those uprisings in terms of bad governance, illegitimate leadership, lack of representation, lack of opportunity, lack of basic freedom, all of those apply in the Palestinian case as much. So in a real sense, Palestinian politics is in some ways not remarkable because it's reflective of these broader patterns in the rest of the Arab world. That's not to say it's any more acceptable or good, but it's not surprising just given the state of Arab politics in general. I think this current state of affairs is all the more alarming given the timing and this particular moment in which we see both unprecedented threats as well as opportunities for Palestinians. So on the threats side of the ledger, You're all familiar with the Israeli settlement project. It is not only flourishing, but it is becoming bolder and I think more aggressive. Since the start of the Oslo process, the settler population has soared from around 250,000 in 1993 to about 700,000 today. So in a few years, we'll actually hit 1 million settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And we've seen also a kind of explosion in what some experts refer to as doomsday settlements, settlements that are in and of themselves almost single-handedly destroy chances for a two-state solution. Those are particularly in key parts of Jerusalem, like the E1 plan near the Ma'ale Adumim settlement block, Givat Hamatos, the Atorot settlement in the northern part of the city. These are, most of them are currently on hold, but what happens is it's a bit like a game of whack-a-mole where, you know, one project emerges, there's pushback from the Biden administration, that project is put on hold, and yet another project emerges in another part of Jerusalem. And but all of them are sort of moving in, they sort of have a life of their own. They don't need approvals necessarily by the highest leaderships at the highest levels of the political echelon. A lot of it is just sort of driven at the bureaucratic level. So those are ongoing. We're seeing an increase in large-scale displacement and dispossession of whole Palestinian communities, most notably in Sheikh Jarrah and other parts of Jerusalem like Silwan. We all watched events unfold last spring, particularly around Sheikh Jarrah. But you have demolitions and expulsions that are happening piecemeal in places like Silwan and other parts of the city that get less media attention than probably the situation in Sheikh Jarrah, but also in parts of the West Bank, like in the South Hebron Hills, where there are communities that are also facing existential threats of expulsion. We even see this trend happening inside Israel, most notably in the Bedouin communities in the Negev. You know, just today we saw police violence and arrests, including of minors, of Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, but who are protesting their dispossession in the Negev. At a regional level, in terms of Arab states, the Palestinian issue is no longer really on the agenda. There's real kind of Arab and regional disinterest in the issue. The so-called Abraham Accords, the series of normalization agreements between Israel and a number of Arab countries. I think there's a lot of wishful thinking associated with these normalization agreements on the part of the Washington policy community in general that wants to be very positive. But the reality is that these normalization agreements, I think, are part of one of the many trends that are working against the Palestinians and that are working against even a two-state solution. Anyone who tries to tell you that the Abraham Accords are good for a two-state solution is I think, being quite disingenuous. I think objectively, in ways that we can actually quantify, the Abraham Accords are directly detrimental to a two-state solution. But the reality in Washington is that if it's good for Israel, it's got to be good, and everyone has to get behind it, even if it's bad. Never mind for Palestinians, even if it's bad for the stated goal of a two-state solution. So regional trends are also working against the Palestinians and a two-state solution. Internally, the Palestinian Authority is facing a an unprecedented financial crisis. They are in large part because international donor funds have more or less dried up. Arab states are no longer, I mean, the Arab states are not only disinterested in the issue, but they're literally divesting from the Palestinian Authority. They were key donors for the Palestinian Authority for years, really since the beginning of the Oslo process. But starting in around 2018, not coincidentally, around at the very same time as the Trump administration, when they started pushing, or at least prepping, for the release of their so-called peace plan. So the Palestinian Authority is broke. They have had to cut back on salaries. I think at this point they're paying a fraction of salaries. At one point it was a quarter. I think it may be a half at this point. The overall donor funds have decreased by more than 60%. So the PA, and that's in addition to the fact that Israel is withholding tax revenues on the pretext of the prisoner payments that are made regularly by the Palestinians to the families of people killed or imprisoned by Israel. So Israel has been withholding tax revenues that are collected from Palestinians that are supposed to be transferred to the Palestinian Authority, and that make up the bulk of the PA's budget. You know, at least more than half, around 60% of their budget come from these tax. So the PA is broke, and so it's a pretty gloomy picture overall. But at the same time, there are a number of I think changes that are positive. There are some opportunities. There is a growing solidarity movement, obviously, with the Palestinians. I think groups like JVP are at the forefront of that. And there's a shifting debate here in the United States. People are talking about Palestinians and Israelis in ways that they've never done before, and that they couldn't do before. And even though it's not affecting the policy yet, it is affecting the political debate and sort of knocking on the door of the policy debate. And so I think it's a matter of when and not if we're likely to see policy shift in accordance with the discourse and the political dynamics shifting in the United States. There's also, I think, within Palestinian society, there's a growing awareness, or sort of rekindling, a revival of civic activism and awareness across all political constituencies, whether they're in Gaza or in East Jerusalem or in the West Bank, or even Palestinians in Israel. We saw after the war in Gaza, or during the war in Gaza, events that Palestinians referred to as the Unity Intifada, because there were, protests happening even among Palestinian citizens of Israel. And so there was this mass mobilization, which is a really big deal in Palestinian terms, because Israel has, like any colonial power, your number one strategy is to divide and rule. And so Palestinian fragmentation, although largely self-inflicted, is also a function of Israeli policy. It is Israeli policy to keep Palestinians divided and separate and fragmented, territorially, demographically, politically, physically, and in any number of ways. And so the ability to overcome that fragmentation and sort of mobilize across these different political and geographic constituencies was seen by a lot of Palestinians as a very significant event. The problem, however, is that in the absence of a credible, cohesive political leadership, there isn't really any actor that can take advantage, that can either confront the challenges. In some cases, they're existential challenges, at least for certain communities of Palestinians, So you don't have a coherent or cohesive leadership that can effectively confront those challenges, but you also don't have a leadership that is capable of successfully capitalizing on the opportunities that exist in the international community or even inside Palestinian society. Sorry, my phone is buzzing. So it's my view that Palestinians cannot do either of these, that is to confront the challenges or to capitalize, take advantage of existing opportunities until they're able to put their internal house in order. So what does that mean, or what does that entail? It's not just a question. I think a lot of analysts look at it as, well, Hamas and Fatah have to get over their infighting, and it's a question of Palestinian reconciliation. I think that is a very significant but an insufficient step. I think that the problem, as I noted before, is much deeper. There needs to be a way to revive Palestinian institutions to create a forum for engaging in politics. Which currently doesn't even really exist. So the question is, how do we do that, or how do they do that? What should be the first step or series of steps that need to be taken? For some people, they say elections are the answer, right? I mean, elections are hugely popular among Palestinians, even though the electoral process that was put in place last year was deeply flawed from a procedural standpoint and from a democratic point of view, in terms of the ability of parties to organize, the ability of particularly opposition parties to mobilize, campaign, and so forth. There was a lot of sort of the leadership putting its thumb on the scale, right? But even with that deeply flawed process, people were excited about elections after so many years of political stagnation. So there is that school of thought that says elections are key. But the question in my mind is, elections for what, and in what sequence? Elections for the PA are not necessarily going to resolve the problem that you have, because you also have the PLO, which historically is not an elected body, but was governed, or was sort of constituted mainly through a quota system, arrived at through consensus building, informal and formal consensus building processes inside the PLO. So that's one question, is elections for what? If you have elections for the PA and not the PLO, if you remember, the PLO is supposed to be the umbrella organization for all Palestinians. It's supposed to represent all Palestinians inside or outside the occupied territories. And it is officially the political address for the Palestinian national movement. It is the body that is represented at the United Nations. It is the body that negotiates. It's the actor that negotiates on behalf of Palestinians, that sign deals with Israel. It's not the PA that signs deals with Israel. Very often you'll see, journalists who report, who talk about restarting negotiations between the Palestinian Authority and Israel. It's a technicality, but it's an important one. The Palestinian Authority is not a political body. At least in its origin. It has, in a lot of ways, usurped the role of the PLO, of the PLO's historic role as the main political address. But again, that is a pathology. That is a sign of the current dysfunction of Palestinian politics. That the emphasis has shifted away from the PLO and toward the Palestinian Authority, right? Because the Palestinian Authority is made up only of Palestinians in the occupied territories. So the majority of Palestinians are excluded from the Palestinian Authority as a decision-making body. And in any case, it's the PLO that is supposed to negotiate on behalf of the Palestinians. So this duality, this confusion, what I sometimes refer to as kind of institutional schizophrenia between the PA and the PLO. I mean, the Palestinian National Movement has an identity crisis. Is it the PLO, the central address, or is it the PA as the state in waiting, where most Palestinian institutional resources are now concentrated because the PLO has basically been hollowed out. So part of reimagining the Palestinian National Movement has to do with redefining the lines, the relationship between these two entities, the Palestinian Authority and the PLO. So this is, I think, one of the issues that's on the agenda. If you just hold elections for the PA, then you've not really resolved the fundamental problem, because groups like Hamas, for example, are not part of the PLO. And so what happens if you get another election where Hamas wins? So without a broader consensus on the political rules of the game, including the role and constitution of the PLO, you're not really going to resolve even something as basic as the political division between Hamas and Fatah. So there, like I said, there are those who push for elections. There's another school of thought, which is to go back to the old PLO model of consensus building. Like I said, the PLO was never a democratic institution. The Palestine National Council, which is sort of the parliament in exile for the PLO historically, was never elected, but it was representative. There were moments, for most of its history, at least throughout the 1970s and 80s, it was a truly representative body in that it represented all Palestinian constituencies, regardless of their geography or political status. It even included Palestinian citizens of Israel. So every major Palestinian constituency was represented in the PLO in terms of the factions, but also in terms of youth groups and women's groups and professional associations and labor unions. They were all part of the PLO. The PLO really was a kind of state in exile, or a state in waiting, or a virtual state, if you will. So I happen to subscribe to the latter view, that what is needed now is not an election, because elections can deepen divisions, as we saw in Palestine, but also as we saw throughout the Arab Spring, where if you hold elections in a highly contested environment where the rules of the game are contested, you end up with more division. You don't resolve problems that way. You could potentially cause more problems. What is more important, I think, is a step that comes before elections, and that is the consensus building process that is needed for all constituencies to feel that they have a stake in this new process, whatever it may be. If everyone decides we're dumping the PA, so be it. If that's the consensus, if people say, you know, we're gonna dump the PLO and we're only gonna focus on building a future Palestinian state through this Palestinian Authority, then that's the consensus. But you can't function when you've got sizable constituencies working at cross purposes with one another. You need to have that basic, I think, consensus building process to answer key questions. Who's going to lead? Is it Hamas? Is it Fatah? Or some other sort of third party alternative? Through what institutional address? Is it the PLO or the PA or both? You know, again, resolving that bifurcation or that confusion between these two bodies. And to what end? Is the goal a one-state solution? Are we still pushing for two states? Something else like confederation? Right now, Palestinian public opinion is kind of all over the map in terms of what the final outcome should look like. And so that's why you need a new consensus building process, I think, to help resolve that that among other questions. Then there's the question of whatever the outcome is, what are the means by which we're supposed to achieve it? Is it the old PLO way of armed struggle and current Hamas approach of violent resistance? Or is it diplomacy and negotiations the way Mahmoud Abbas and his Fatah party have insisted for the past 30 years? Or is it something else? Is it kind of the civil society-led initiatives like nonviolent resistance or civil resistance, as it's sometimes called? All three of these are in play right now in Palestinian society, in differing in different ways, right? So it's kind of nonsensical if part of the Palestinians are waging a military war and another part is engaged in negotiations, and yet another part is involved in nonviolent civil resistance. It doesn't make any sense. They all sort of cancel each other out. You can have a military strategy that complements a diplomatic strategy that complements a civil society strategy, but they all have to work in concert toward the same goal. And that's, again, where I think a consensus building process is the initial step that needs to happen. So all of these questions, I think, are interlinked. The answers to these questions will take time for Palestinians to develop, but in a lot of ways, I think that conversation, in a very messy way and in fits and starts, has at least already started. Like I said, as messy as it is. And I think that's probably a good place to leave it and just sort of open it up to you all.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I'm just going to put myself beside you so that other people can see me. I'm Amy Schuster. I'm a member of the Jewish Voice for Peace in Columbus. And I've been managing some of the recording. And so I apologize if I've been on and off screen. But we had a few questions in the chat, but I also would just encourage people who would like to ask a question to unmute themselves. So we have set it up so that you're muted upon entry, but you do have the power to unmute yourself if you do want to voice your own question. There was one question in the chat from Ishmael Sam, at least that's the name on the account. Would a coalition of parties against both Fatah and Hamas form at least the beginnings of a viable opposition?
That's a good question. I think that was on the mind, when elections were announced. That was definitely on the mind of a lot of people in Palestinian society. There was a fear, and that sort of thinking was driven by a fear that Hamas and Fatah were together kind of pre-cooking the outcome. And those fears were founded. I mean, I think it was pretty clear, as much as these two factions may hate each other, the bigger danger isn't their infighting, but for a lot of people when they come together, because they both have autocratic tendencies, they both have illiberal tendencies, and they are both very well resourced and dominant, whereas third parties are really struggling. Even some of the historically vibrant parties like the PFLP and DFLP that have been around for decades, the old left has really suffered a lot. I think, globally, particularly since the fall of the Soviet Union, but also in recent times. So there was a real fear that Hamas and Fatah would sort of pre-cook the outcome. And I think that was their plan. There were even discussions between Hamas and Fatah to run a joint list, which would obviously dominate. And they would, so in that way, they would just decide who would get how many seats in the cabinet and, beforehand. And they could just share power that way. And things were sort of moving in that direction until there was a dissident faction within Fatah that said, hell no, we don't want a pre-cooked election. We don't actually like Abbas's leadership. We want to see a competitive election. Part of the problem there, you know, and I'm getting now to the answer to answer this question, part of the reason why you couldn't get a viable coalition of third-party forces to oppose Hamas and Fatah was numerically, it was very hard, but organizationally, it would have been very difficult in the 4 or 5 or 6 week period of the campaign to put that together. You know, you'd have to have, I mean, we know from our own elections in this country, elections are about organizing and about resources. Who are the best resourced political groups, and how much and how organized are they? There's a relationship between, you know, the more organized you are, the more resources you can raise. The more resources you have, the more organized you can become, and so it sort of feeds itself. So Hamas and Fatah have those historical organizations. They have the grassroots cadres. They've got financial resources. They have their patronage networks to keep them loyal. So the smaller parties, especially new ones, and there were dozens of new lists that emerged that registered for these elections, you know, across the ideological spectrum. So you'd have to imagine that have to overcome the resource disadvantage, ideological differences among them, right? They would have to figure out, how do we actually work together how do we have a common political program when some groups are center, some groups are right, some groups are left, some are secular, some are, you know, quasi-Islamist. And so there are a lot of disadvantages. And so I think, especially when the campaign period was so short, it would have been very hard for an outcome like that to materialize, which is why they set it up that way. They didn't want these opposition forces to gain strength. They wanted to build in their own institutional advantages, they being Hamas and Fatah.
Thank you. I see a question from our group. If you don't mind, I will add you to our conversation. Lori Hannawalt, or if you want to introduce yourself.
I'm listening to this conversation. I'm a person that came into the problems in Palestine in 1914 when the second slaughter, or not the second, but a slaughter in Gaza. And I had already heard about other slaughters earlier. And I've joined like half a dozen peace groups in America that our whole focus, and Jewish Voice for Peace is one of them, is Palestine. I've been there 3 times. And, you know, I hear you talking about, like, if there's any power with Palestinian group, Hamas, PA, or any of them. I mean, the problem is you got a psychopathic regime in Israel, and you got an American government that has got their whole American government's got their nose up their butt. I mean, honestly, it's disgusting. I don't know what to do with it, but I'm thinking somehow we need to erase 99% of our government. There's a few beautiful women that got the guts to speak out, but these men, these white men that are running our government, are a bunch of cowards, treasonous. They're destroying our country. They're destroying your country. They're destroying our planet. I don't know what to do with it, but I don't think any of these groups in Palestine are going to stop what's going on.
Thank you. Did you want to respond to that? those concerns?
Well, I mean, I don't know, maybe I missed it, but I don't know that there was a question in there. I mean, I think the frustration, I think a lot of people, obviously in this room, share those frustrations. I know I share the frustration certainly about our government and our policies. So I can commiserate, I suppose. I can relate. I'm not so naive as to think that changes in public opinion or even changes in politics will suddenly produce the kinds of policies we want to see. I mean, not just on this issue, but on a host of issues, whether it's climate or other foreign policy issues or whatever. The science is in certain places, the analysis is in a certain place, public opinion is in a certain place, but it takes a long time because of the nature of our political system, where it's about money and it's about running campaigns, and so powerful interest groups, whether they're political constituencies or corporations, or other vested interests, they have a disproportionate say in our politics and in our policy making. We know that, from guns to climate to foreign policy, it's not terribly democratic, or at least in terms of, there's a distinct gap with public opinion. So, but that's the nature of our political system, which I think, frankly, it's become more so. I think it's become less representative and less responsive to ordinary citizens, for a host of reasons. And that's why we're seeing, I think, a surge on the progressive left. I think that probably explains the popularity of someone like Bernie Sanders, and the relative success of people like Elizabeth Warren. I mean, there's a multiplicity of views. In other words, it's no longer just a progressive wing against the political establishment in the Democratic Party. I think there is a full spectrum on the left, and there are a range of issues, and these issues are being debated, but there's limited political space. So I guess my long-winded way of saying I can relate to your frustration, but I guess we just got to keep at it. I don't know what to say.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe it's partially about campaign finance efforts or campaign finance reform efforts in the United States, to
Certainly.
change the nature of how power flows or how voice flows into policy. Okay. So there were a few other questions in the chat. So Michael Friedman asks, do you see a turning point for the US to back off its support for a two-state solution when Israel is clearly unwilling to allow it to happen? And if so, what might be that turning point?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. Obviously, none of us here is in a position to predict the future. At least I'm not. I mean, but we can look at the trend lines, and there is a certain, there is no doubt which direction the trend lines are pointing in. And it's not the changes that are happening in terms of American demographics and public opinion are not just on the left. And now I'm isolating just the Israel-Palestine issue, setting aside other issues. Even if you look at evangelicals, there is a massive generational divide between evangelicals who are Gen Xers and baby boomers and those who are millennials and Gen Z. Just like I think in in the Jewish community, there's a generational divide. We're really seeing a massive generational divide that cuts across ideological and political groups. And so I saw a poll recently, I think it was like, you know, the standard question of, do you sympathize more with Israelis or Palestinians? Among evangelicals, you would expect it's going to be pretty skewed in Israel's favor. And it is, until you break out the 30 and under group, where it's actually reversed, where it's a majority, 60%, I think, something like that. Don't quote me, but it was a clear majority of evangelicals who say they sympathize more with Palestinians. That is compared with, I think in 2018, it was around 28% of that 30 and under group, right? So that's a huge shift in a very, very short period of time. So the political ground on which all of these policies are based on is shifting in tectonic ways. And so it's really hard to predict when or even if. I mean, I think the if is probably, I don't think it's a question of if, it's probably a question of when. Is it going to be in the next presidential election cycle in 2024? Probably not. Or it's going to be felt, I think, in subtle ways. Maybe we'll see it, you know, in 2028 and 2032, I don't know. But even if, you know, another way to look at it is if you look at just the Democratic Party. Now we know that Biden, the person of Joe Biden, the president, is probably the most hawkish in his party on this issue, right? It used to be the Democratic Party. He was the standard bearer of where the Democratic Party was on Israel-Palestine, where Hillary Clinton is, where Joe Biden are. I mean, that is the standard. Now he is the rightmost fringe of the Democratic Party. That's not to say that the party establishment has embraced Palestinian rights, but there is a shift, and that shift is being felt at the political level. One way, you know, one of the signs for me was during the Gaza war in May, when you had Bob Menendez of New Jersey, who is definitely in, you know, if you're going to divide members of Congress into like, you know, AIPAC, J Street, and, you know, if not now or something, he's definitely in the AIPAC wing of the Democratic Party. And even he sent a letter to President Biden saying, this has gone on too long, this is too much. I think it was the bombing, the Israeli, when they bombed the media building in Gaza that collapsed that building. I think that was the trigger for the letter. So when you see people like Bob Menendez or Chuck Schumer, who are starting to weigh in on the issue, maybe in very mild ways, but they're saying things that they didn't used to say, and that frankly, they don't have to say, because the politics, at least at a national level, aren't quite. But why does Bob Menendez of New Jersey say things like that? Well, my sense is because he's feeling the pressure from his constituents in New Jersey. I think he understands the political changes that have happened in his party, among his constituents. And like any good politician, whether you believe in it or not, you're going to be responsive to it. And so we're already, you know, we're seeing that shift happen. And so the next generation of Democratic Party leaders, set aside the Republican Party for now, the next generation of Democratic Party leaders are going to, by definition, be more to the left than where Joe Biden is. So to me, that's the good news is, you know, Biden is the past. The future may not necessarily be Betty McCollum and Rashida Tlaib, but it's definitely not Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. The future of the party is probably somewhere in between. So I think it's going to be a gradual and subtle process that, you know, we see the influences in a kind of piecemeal way, as opposed to, one day someone decides, I think, frankly, even if Bernie Sanders were president, we wouldn't see like, okay, I'm cutting off aid to Israel tomorrow, because you still need Congress to do that, and there'd be a lot of resistance, and as a politician, he would be responsive to the pressures of even his right flank in his party. So whatever configuration of politicians we end up with, I think we're going to see these piecemeal changes. But for me, the most important thing is that we can have this debate now in ways that we couldn't for the past 30 years. There's been no space for debate, in part because of the Oslo process and the peace process, and this notion of we need to maintain this bipartisan consensus on Israel. That has fueled, I think, a stifling of the debate. I say this publicly, the best thing to happen on this issue is the collapse of this bipartisan consensus on Israel, because it means we can actually have a debate now. There was no possibility of having a debate when you've got a bipartisan consensus that, by definition, doesn't allow debate. So, yeah, I mean, again, I'm sorry for the long-winded answer, but.
Yeah, I mean, also kind of maybe wrapped into that, although I do want to get back to the chat, but I mean, wrapped into that is what might happen at the midterms here in the United States. So there's a lot of estimations that there might be a flip in the House, and that does then reintroduce like the broader question about the status in the Republican Party, not just in the Democratic Party. I didn't know if you wanted to.
It's true, yeah. But we can't just talk about one side of the political equation. There is a Republican Party. It is a very relevant, active, and powerful party. Controls most of the state legislatures in the country. I'm not sure about governors, but I think they also have a majority of governors. And they are poised, I think, to retake at least the House. I think very possibly both houses in this year. And we know that President Trump is coming back in 2024. We know that he still has his constituency. We know that he hasn't really been damaged politically in that constituency by January 6th or by 2 impeachments or COVID or climate denial. Any of those things, they haven't helped. They haven't hurt, but they probably helped him. And frankly, even if it's not Donald Trump, there are plenty of Trump acolytes waiting in the wing to be his successor. And so that's just the way the party's going. And so, yeah, things could get worse before they get better, in that we could see a return of Republican control over the Congress and quite possibly in 2024, the White House, in which case, things will get really bad for Palestinians in that case, but I think there will be a much greater backlash than what we saw over the last 4 years. I mean, frankly, the combination of a Trump and a Netanyahu environment has been pretty good for Palestinians in terms of public diplomacy, in terms of public opinion, not in terms of obviously realities on the ground. Things have been terrible, but in terms of shifting people's opinions, that was a good formula for the pro-Palestinian wing of society, right? So if we go back to that, I would expect to see a resurgence. We'll see, I think, a mushrooming of the Palestinian solidarity movement.
I think there's a question that asks us to sort of look backwards, and then there's another question about the future. And so, if you wouldn't mind, just can you remind us about like what are the scope or the possibilities for Palestinians to make decisions about the PA? How much is that hampered by the Oslo process? Or yeah, can you just remind us of some of those details? Just because you were saying that if we could have more of an open debate about which direction we want to go in, and we just weren't quite certain what exactly were the movable goalposts.
Yeah, I mean, well, up until now, ordinary Palestinians haven't had much of a say, and that's one reason why they were so eager and excited about having even flawed, flawed elections. And so, Palestinians historically have a very vibrant civil society. Oslo actually, and there are a number of really strong academic studies on this issue, but Oslo really hurt Palestinian civil society. There's a great book by one of our non-resident fellows at MEI, Dana Al-Kurd, called Polarized and Demobilized. And Mahaj Adallah, I think, also has written on the topic about how Oslo, because of its political goals, has really worked to demobilize Palestinian society, and in a lot of ways to depoliticize Palestinian society and civil society in the interest of this peace process, right? In the interest of kind of suppressing opposition to Oslo. Oslo didn't interfere in Israeli politics and society, but it was very actively involved in almost micromanaging Palestinian politics and society. So it's had a, and I write about this in my book too, it's had a very negative effect on Palestinian society, and it's helped produce the kind of fragmentation and demobilization that we now see. So there are some structural disadvantages that Palestinians have when it comes to overcoming that. That said, they are trying to overcome it. I think there is a debate among Palestinians. It's been going on for years about, should we dissolve the PA? Should we keep it? Is it even useful? I think the more people who are inclined to say two-state solution is no longer possible are likely to say we should dissolve the Palestinian Authority. An extension of the occupation, that the peace process would move in that direction, just given the massive power asymmetry and even the relationship between the United States and Israel. The United States being, the chief sponsor of this process. So, if the U.S. has its thumb on the scale for Israel, and it's also the party that is designing the peace process, it's designing it in a way that is to Israel's advantage, whether it's conscious or not, and to the disadvantage of Palestinians. And so a lot of what the peace process has done is to sort of tie the hands of Palestinian civil society and opposition forces. But there is space, I think, to overcome that. I think one of the it's a bit ironic, but in some ways, the pathologies of Palestinian politics have actually worked to the advantage of civil society. So, for example, the fact that, yes, Palestinians are fragmented, but that has also meant that the Palestinian Authority doesn't have jurisdiction in places like East Jerusalem and in Gaza. And lo and behold, what are the two areas that are the most dynamic and very often the most violent and unstable? They're also East Jerusalem and Gaza. And so these are areas that are free of Palestinian Authority repression, where you see the most dynamic activism, whether it's the Gaza March of Return or the protests against the expulsions in Sheikh Jarrah, or a few months before then, or last year, when we saw there are these kind of ad hoc moments of mobilization that emerge around things like, remember when they tried to install these security cameras at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, and there was like a mini rebellion against that, and then the Israelis eventually backed down. And then, you know, of course, any type of encroachment on the holy site of Al-Aqsa Mosque by Jewish extremists always gets a response. And so the fact that the Palestinian Authority doesn't operate there, there's no security coordination happening in those areas. There is no Palestinian Authority that's going to go in and, you know, sort of break up meetings or arrest dissidents because they don't have jurisdiction there. Of course, the Israelis do that, but it's a different dynamic. And so you have, you know, in some ways that dysfunction has worked to the advantage of, and fragmentation has actually worked to the advantage of Palestinian civil society. So there are some ways to overcome them, but for the moment they're ad hoc and spontaneous, and they're not organized and cohesive. I think in order to have a mass mobilization of some sort, you need one, organizational coherence, and two, you need some level of ideological coherence. People have to know that they're fighting for the same thing. You can't have groups that, you know, are waging armed struggle and their neighbors are engaged in negotiations. That diminishes the effectiveness of both of them. And you know, it's a reason why, you know, I write in my book, it's why negotiations failed, because you can't make war against one group of Palestinians at the same time you're negotiating peace with another. That's nonsensical. And yet that was US policy. So I don't know if I addressed the question head on, but there are signs of, you know, Palestinians have agency. And one thing that's different about the, you know, let's say 5 or 10 years ago, they are exercising that agency in collective ways that are more effective, not quite where I think they need to be in terms of mass mobilization, but more effective than they were a few years ago.
Thank you. So I guess this question is from Charlene Fix. It's a question about the future. So do you hold any hope for fresh leadership, for reframing of the political situation, for something like an original solution in the youth, maybe in Gaza, or in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in the United States, or in the camps? So Charlene says, I see some real excitement about leadership development from a female We Are Not Numbers mentee in Gaza. So so this is a group of youth who are seeking to publish themselves, and they and Charlene has connected with one of them. So does that sort of give you any hope, or where are you looking to these days?
I think so. I mean, I think there is reason to be optimistic, and there is cause for hope, because, you know, part of, you know, the stagnation that we're seeing in the Palestinian leadership is a generational issue. I mean, Mahmoud Abbas is not a young guy. I mean, he's 86. He's a chain smoker. He's overweight. He's, you know, he's frankly not going to be around forever. All right, we know that. He's probably not going to be around for much longer, and that generation also is disappearing. The vast majority of Palestinians are under 40, and and they haven't had so far the opportunity, you know, because of the dominance of groups like Hamas and Fatah over the past, you know, 20 some odd years. there's an entire generation that's been excluded. I mean, people my generation, like, you know, Palestinian Gen Xers, aren't really in positions of power. They feel like they missed their chance because of Oslo, because of the peace process, because of PA repression. But the next generation, the millennials and Gen Z, who are the majority demographically, there's no question that once this generation passes from the scene, things will be very, very different by default, by definition, because, you know, the old, they're just not there anymore. And even frankly, the younger generation of Fatah, and by younger I mean in their 50s and 60s, there's real dissent inside Fatah's ranks. So there is definitely an opportunity. I think that opportunity will play itself out when Mahmoud Abbas departs. There, you know, there's both promise and risk, right? Because there's likely to be a power struggle internally within Fatah for control, because the one who controls Fatah probably controls the PLO and most likely the PA as well. But there will also be a struggle between Fatah, some new configuration, whatever Fatah emerges, whatever emerges out of a post-Abbas era inside Fatah and Hamas on the other hand. But I think it will also lead to a proliferation of new parties. I mean, there were 2 or 3 factions within Fatah who were kind of, you describe them as dissident factions. One of the reasons why, I know there was a question about why did Abbas cancel elections. One of the reasons was divisions within Fatah. There were 2 or 3 factions, at least, 2 pretty prominent dissident factions. So the fact that Fatah couldn't run a unified list put him at a disadvantage against Hamas, which was unified and were going to run unified lists. And so, you know, there was a real risk that he would lose those elections just based on lack of discipline and lack of organization in his own party. But at the same time, those dissident factions, maybe they'll take over Fatah when he goes. Maybe they'll turn into other kind of third-party movements, you know, that will evolve in different directions. Maybe some new group will see an opportunity and say, look, we're the true successors of the old Fatah, which is now obsolete because, you know, that generation, that founding generation has passed. There are lots of different possibilities. None of them, I think, are in play at the moment. And as long as Mahmoud Abbas is frankly alive. I think once he passes from the scene, it creates all kinds of opportunities, but also the potential for chaos.
Okay, thank you so much.
Amy, I have a feeling probably we should end soon, you know, to allow Khaled to, you know, to rest a bit. And I was wondering, did you have anything you wanted to say finally, Amy or Connie? Maybe you wanted to say something.
I just want to thank you for, this is a wealth of information, a lot to process. But I did have one question, and maybe you have some final thoughts to wrap up. I think there was a recent meeting between Benny Gantz and Abbas, and there was a lot of dissension about that on both sides, you know, the Israelis and Palestinians both. But I don't know what came of that or what it was about. Do you have any insights into that meeting and any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any inside information on that. I have the same information that you all have in terms of public source, you know, media and news. But I found that meeting very interesting. I mean, I think it was significant because it was a very high level meeting. obviously the Minister of Defense, and President Abbas, the highest ranking Israeli official of this government. So that was important. And the fact that he met in Gantz's home, that Abbas went to Israel, met in his home, that was new and different. But what I was more fascinated by was the reaction to it, the responses to it in the kind of Washington commentariat. I thought it was amusing because there was so much projection and wishful thinking and almost fantastical thinking about, oh, this is such a good sign, this could lead to this is just what is needed for a political breakthrough. The reality of that meeting was it was actually much more pessimistic than what a lot of people, I think, wanted to spin it. It was a meeting that was very pragmatic. We all know there's security coordination between Israelis and Palestinians. The Israeli defense minister is effectively the ruler of the West Bank because the military is in charge of everything in the West Bank. And this was an attempt, I think the Israeli interest in it was the Palestinian Authority is teetering on the edge of collapse financially and institutionally. They're hugely unpopular, all the reasons that we laid out up front. They're broke, they're unpopular, and so forth. And so this was really a meeting about how do we Israelis shore up this Palestinian Authority and prevent it from collapsing. The way it was received in Washington was, oh, this is the first hopeful sign for maybe this is going to be the beginning of a political process. And to me, it just reeked of projection and wishful thinking and almost magical thinking, frankly. And it was kind of sad because they took what was a really pessimistic reality and tried to turn it into something that was potentially promising. So for me, that was much more telling than the actual meeting. The meeting unfolded the way you'd expect. Israelis spun it the way Israelis do, and they said, no, this is not political. There's not going to be any negotiations, and don't get your hopes up. The Palestinians said, no, we went to that meeting to emphasize the need for a political horizon. Otherwise, there will be an explosion, which may be, in fact, what both sides were saying to each other. But it's not necessarily what each side took away. But the reality was, for both of them, I think where they agree is the PA is on the verge of collapse. We have to do something to prevent this. For Abbas, it's his political, maybe even physical survival. For the Israelis, you need the PA. The PA is essential to maintaining the status quo. If the PA collapses, it is going to be bad for the Palestinians in the short term, but much worse, I think, for the Israelis in the medium and long term.
Well, thank you so much, Khaled, really, from Jewish Voice for Peace. We really appreciate everything, that you do. And thank you so much for all of this excellent information. Don't forget, everyone, that we will be back, as I mentioned earlier, next month on the 22nd of February for another presentation. As I mentioned, it will be Reverend Michael Yoshi, who's the co-chair of the Friends of Wadi Fokin. He will be speaking about what they do to help that particular Palestinian village. So for all of us here in Columbus and other places, thank you all for joining us, and especially for Khaled for all of his excellent reportage here. And thank you, Amy, for you doing that, and especially to Connie for doing all that she does here. Okay, everyone, take care.
Well, thank you. I just want to say thank you all. Thank you all, especially for not just for having me here, but for all of what
Yeah.
you do, which I think is more important than what I do.
Absolutely not, but thank you. Thank you
Okay,
so much.
take care, everyone.
Okay, good
All right.
night.
Yeah, nice
Good
to see you.
night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.